It's a great pleasure to be asked back here to speak, and particularly as we're actually so near the statue of Florence Nightingale herself. You can't quite see it from this window, but if you open the window behind me and leaned out slightly to your left, I think you might be able to just catch a glimpse of her next to her friend and colleague Sydney Herbert. So when you're leaving the event today, please do take time to stop and give her a bit of a wave on your way past. Now, I'd like to start off today's talk by explaining the title that we have up on the screen behind me. It's actually a quotation that, when I read it, gave me the idea for writing this whole talk. And it's funny that something just sometimes catches your imagination and it gives you an idea that leads to something much wider. The quotation comes from a letter written in 1868, where Florence was writing to refuse a request for a photograph of herself. And she said, "I have a superstition, as far as myself is concerned, against images made by hands. I would rather leave no memorial of my name or anything else." Now, in this phrase, images made by hand, she's referring, appropriately enough, to the type of religious icon that's found in the Orthodox Church. It's called a chiropieta, and it means, literally in the Greek, made without hands. And these images are believed to have basically miraculously appeared and not to have been made by any human intervention at all. Now, Nightingale's dislike of the limelight is very well known, but it seems that her reluctance of having her image taken is actually deeper than just being a practical tactic of hiding away from the public gaze. In fact, it was actually against her principles, and this is very tightly linked into her religious faith. Her copy of the Bible is annotated, and against the line "vanity of vanities, all is vanity," she's written that the worst vanity is the idolatry of our fellow mortals, which I think is quite telling. If she had allowed images of herself to be circulated, she would be fanning the flames of public interest in herself as an individual. But of course, equally, she wasn't averse to using that power of the personality herself when it came to using her fame as to influence to get her own way. And this tension I find particularly interesting on a personal level, as it reflects an inherent tension in my own work. As quoted above, Nightingale wished for no memorial to her name. And yet, as in my job as director of the Florence Nightingale Museum, that's my job, is to create and to promote a memorial to her name. Now, of course, I'm surrounded by images of Nightingale on a daily basis, and most of them we wouldn't count as portraits as such. Some of them don't bear any resemblance to her at all. They were just sort of mass circulated images. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm concentrating largely on images that are held in the Florence Nightingale Museum, occasionally for the purposes of illustrating an especial point. I will be using an image from another collection, but in that case I'll flag that up to you just to draw your attention to it, and I've done that when I needed it for a specific reason. So to start off with, this is one of ours. It's a lovely, very large oil painting, not on display in the museum. And it's entitled Mrs. W.E. Nightingale and Her Elder Daughter Parthenope, and it's by an unknown artist in 1819. And it's a good example of a fairly traditional portrait. It's a clear status symbol that would have been painted by, would have been commissioned by a wealthy minority. And it's a portrait that's similar to the ones that were often painted of wealthy young men when carrying out the famous Grand Tour of Europe. And usually they have a very clear representation as to where they are. In this case, it's Naples, and you can see, as a bit of a clue there, there's Vesuvius smoking away in the background. This particular Grand Tour that took place that's being recorded here by Nightingale's parents was sort of a sort of protracted honeymoon, because it was a tour of Europe that took place immediately following their wedding. But it was such long duration that they had not one but two children over the course of it. The Parthenope born in Naples and Florence born in an Italian city. I'm sure some of the more astute amongst you will have worked out which Italian city Florence was born in. I'm being slightly cheeky by including this image as a portrait of Florence Nightingale, because she's a sort of unseen presence, because Parthenope is sitting on her mother's lap, but there's less than a year between them. So she would definitely have been pregnant with Florence by the time that Parthenope had reached this age of about 7 or 8 months. So she's like sitting on her younger sister. The family returned to England in 1821 with their two very young daughters, and they settled eventually between two houses, Lea Hearst in Derby, and then later on Embley in Hampshire. And this is Lea Hearst behind me on the screen, drawn a pen and ink drawing by Parthenope. Lea Hearst, it was built on inherited land, and William Nightingale built the house with 15 bedrooms because they were very keen on entertaining, and there was a steady stream of relations and friends passing through the house pretty well at all times. I ought to mention as well, if there are any lovers of Victorian literature amongst us, it also has an important association because Elizabeth Gaskell was a friend of the Nightingales, and she spent quite a lot of time at Lea Hearst and wrote most of North and South while staying in the nurseries there. As I mentioned, this is by Parthenope. It's, as you can see from the drawing, it's very accomplished. And it's actually quite fortunate for us that Nightingale had both a sister and a cousin who were particularly artistic and used all of their relations as models. This is, again, by Parthenope, and it's a pencil and wash of Florence and their cousin Marianne at Embley in Hampshire. And as you can see, she's a very competent artist. This particular scene, I don't know how many of you saw Great Expectations at Christmas, but I think this room looks very, very like Miss Havisham's room. But I imagine it was in a lot better nick because they were quite well off. But I think the effect of the wash makes it look very, very dramatic. Now, when Nightingale's education is being described as a child and a young girl, she was initially educated by governesses, but then later on by their father. He took on the education of both the girls. And great emphasis is always made that Nightingale studied the sciences and maths in particular, and fairly traditionally male activities. But yet we know, as far as the more feminine arty side of things, we know from William Nightingale's notebooks that they did also study drawing and music and fancy work. I'm not quite sure what fancy work is, actually, but it sounds very feminine. Footstools, maybe, that sort of thing. So we know that they did pursue artistic accomplishments, and Parthenope in particular had a real eye for beauty, and we can see this recorded in her letters as well as in her artwork. Even more artistic than Parthenope was their cousin Johanna Bonham Carter, and who's the artist of this beautiful profile of Florence as a young girl. And it's really Hilary's artwork that I think gives us the most enduring images of a Nightingale as a young woman. Hilary was a very gifted young woman, and certainly, although she died reasonably young, Nightingale in adulthood was often quite worried. She felt that she was squandering her talents, so she was undoubtedly a very talented artist, and she felt that she was wasting this talent. So it's about the age that we see Nightingale in this portrait, that she announced to her rather horrified parents that she wanted to become a nurse. Now, of course, nurses at this time had a very, very bad reputation. The Dickens' character of Mrs. Gamp in Martin Chuzzlewit is often held up. They were seen as being dirty, drunk, dishonest. How accurate this portrayal is there's currently some work being done on this. It may be that this was a caricature, but nevertheless, we can see that that this dislike or distrust of nurses continued. And Nightingale herself said that you would have thought that I had wanted to be a kitchen maid when she described her parents' reaction to sharing this ambition with them. So her ambitions were temporarily squashed by her horrified parents, and so she adopted basically the life of a upper middle class young woman prior to marriage, and that was very clearly what the expectations on both of the Nightingale girls. They were expected to marry respectably. And we can see in a letter at this time, Nightingale writes, "What have I done this last fortnight? Learnt 7 tunes by heart, written various letters, ridden with papa, paid 8 visits, done company, and that is all." And I think that gives us a window into the frustration and boredom that a very bright and energetic young woman would have felt on basically not being allowed to do anything at all very much. So it's partly to lift her from this depression that she accompanied friends to Europe, again in the late 1840s. And again, as the family was wealthy, they did travel fairly extensively. Nightingale went to Egypt and then on to Greece, and finally ending up in Dresden and Berlin, where she persuaded her parents to let her spend 2 weeks at the Kaiserswerth Deaconesses Institution to receive some basic training in nursing. And it was at this time that this carte de visite photograph was taken that we have on the screen at the moment. This, I should mention, isn't actually one of ours at the Nightingale Museum. It's actually in the archives of Clayton, which was later the home of Parthenope, who married Sir Harry Vernie. And there's a very extensive Nightingale archive at Clayton. They very kindly have loaned it to us, and we're going to have it on display in the Nightingale Museum next month, which is quite exciting. I don't know if you know carte de visite photographs. They're all of exactly the same size, slightly bigger than a sort of cigarette card size. They're absolutely ubiquitous at about this time through the 1850s onwards. And for those of us who want to get a clearer sense of 19th century life, they're a lovely resource, but they're also incredibly frustrating as well, because they were so popular and they were relatively affordable. There are literally thousands of these milling around, but people would nearly always wear their best clothes, so they aren't at all a good way of learning what people wore as part of everyday life, for example. Particularly frustrating, I imagine, for historians of fashion, as it tends to be the best and good quality clothes that tend to survive in museums or in private collections. And also in terms of architectural historians, in terms of interiors, the images were nearly always shot in studios. So even if you have a shot of a portrait that looks as though it's set in somebody's front room or hallway, it's nearly always a set. So, of course, it's not at all the same as having thousands of real domestic interiors recorded, which would be a really amazing resource to 19th century historians. So it's very similar to an 18th century conversation piece painting that, again, that sort of recording that on the face of it is a recording of somebody's setting, but in fact is quite often a mainstream, a fairly sort of stylised setting. Often with 18th century portraiture, you can see the same family set several times in the same room, so it's not necessarily an accurate recording of their background. In the selection of carte de visite photographs of Nightingale, we can see that she's following the direction of pose that is most common at the time. That and these are quite gender specific to gender. So women would often be directed to be looking down or looking thoughtful, and often having their hands folded and their arms very close to their bodies. Whereas the male portraits, they in fact take a much greater ownership of the space. So you'll see arms jutting out at right angles and hands on canes, or, you know, having your legs apart, which of course you wouldn't have a nicely brought up young lady doing. So just to underline this point, as I said, you can see that we have Nightingale here looking down and looking actually quite pleased with herself. The Nightingale's biographer, Mark Bostridge, points out that this photograph, probably the earliest photograph taken by Nightingale, taken of Nightingale, was taken in Berlin just after she'd got her own way about being allowed to train as a nurse. And Bostridge feels that you can tell she is actually quite pleased at having got her own way in this photograph. I think that's maybe stretching a point a little bit, but I quite like the idea behind it. But just to sort of reinforce my point about the stylised physical poses, I just wanted to show you this sketch. It's another sketch by Parthenope of Nightingale with Sir John Sutherland and John McNeill. This, I ought to mention, is another part of the Clayton archive, but is also being loaned to us and will be on display at the Nightingale Museum next month, because we like to sort of keep a changing display. But in this, you can see that her pose is much more active, and she's got her arms out and she's leaning forward. And I think this, in a way, feels much more characteristic that the things that we know about Nightingale, the way that Nightingale engaged with people. I think, you know, for me, this somehow feels more true. The next carte de visite photograph, by now, this is taken in 1853 or 4 by the photographer Edward Kilburn of Regent Street, and he was Queen Victoria's favourite photographer. This is part of the reason for this huge popularity in carte de visite photographs, of course, is that Queen Victoria and her family were photographed regularly, and this was something that led to the craze, cartomania, as it was called. By the time this picture was taken, Nightingale had completely overcome her parents' resistance to her becoming a nurse, and she was a superintendent to the Establishment for Gentlewomen During Illness that was based in Harley Street. And in this way, this image is probably the last time that her image was taken in any way before she became the second most famous woman in England and left to nurse at the base hospitals in the Crimean War. And again, you can see that she has this very sort of feminine, demure pose, doubtless following the direction of the photographer. Now, this fame that was to cause Nightingale such discomfort was partly due to the explosion of the popular press from the mid-19th century onwards. And it was this, of course, that led to the coverage of the war being much more detailed, but also much more swift than would have been at all possible in any previous conflicts. So because of this, the public consciousness of the soldiers was very high, and equally it meant that Nightingale's resulting fame was able to just balloon out in the same way. Technologies of printing and publishing were starting to progress at speed by the time Nightingale was a teenager. She was born in 1820, just to remind you. And this led to a really massive increase of all printed ephemera. The family only, as Nightingale's fame began to spread, the family only released 2 images of her, which was why nearly all of the popular images don't really bear very much resemblance to her at all. Behind me is one of the 2, by Hilary Bonham Carter of Nightingale. These 2 images were adapted and reproduced, but the lithographs that were sold of these images were actually quite expensive and would have been out of the reach of most of the public at the time. This was the second one that was released, the drawing of Nightingale. This is a sketch by Parthenope, also including a portrait of her little owl, Athena, which on its death was stuffed and can be found sitting on its little branch in the Nightingale Museum. So next time you come over, you must make sure that you say hello to Athena, the real owl. Yes, it's very Victorian having your pet stuffed after they die, but it's quite nice for us, and the school children absolutely love it. We're very popular with the school groups, and they always like to say hello to Athena the owl. This image of Nightingale, with, of course, the association of owls and wisdom, but yet a beautiful young girl, was a very popular image, particularly after it was reproduced, as you can see here, in the Illustrated Times in 1856. So broadsheets had rough images of Nightingale's images, and as we've seen, these were largely highly fictional. There were also penny biographies and sentimental songs, some of which have got quite extraordinary titles. Angels with Sweet Approving Smiles is one that I can imagine would have been a bit of a hit, and The Shadow on the Pillow as well was one that caught my attention. Her portrait was even printed on paper bags, which we hold in the collection as something that's a useful resource to somebody, I expect. There were Staffordshire china figures made of Nightingale, again, that bore very little resemblance to her. Some of these images were actually, this was exploding at home in the UK, and some of these images were sent out to Nightingale at Scutari. When she replied, thanking the senders for their letter, she added, "My effigies and praises were less welcome." So again, we can really see the beginning of this dislike of having her image circulated. This is one of the very few recordings of the barracks hospital at Scutari. It's very sadly not actually owned by the museum, but it's kindly lent by the artist's family, and who have permitted us to photograph it. It's a series of sketches and watercolours by one of the nurses who went out to Scutari, Anne Morton, and it's a really amazing record. As you can see, she's nowhere near as accomplished as Parthenope and Hilary, and a lot of them, the perspective is really out. I mean, it's not too bad in this one, although the people look a bit odd, but some of them, particularly the long shots of the wards, are really very strange, but they're an incredible record, particularly of, again, what people wore and what they were doing. So this is Miss Nightingale's room. I ought to mention the famous association of the lady with the lamp. The idea of Florence Nightingale carrying a lamp was popularised by the Illustrated London News, and that was when it first came out. But we don't know the artist who was first responsible for portraying her with a lamp. But of course, it's a very enduring image, and the actual lamp that she owned is also on display in the museum. For those of you that don't know, slightly surprisingly, it's not the sort of brass genie lamp that people tend to assume, and actually is on the statue outside in Waterloo Place. It's actually like a sort of concertina tube, a Chinese travelling lantern, which often surprises people. This is another carte de visite. I think you're probably getting the idea that the carte de visites are really responsible for most of our enduring images of Nightingale. On her return to England, she managed to avoid the fuss that she so hated. And her aunt wrote, "Weary and worn as she is, I can't tell you the dread that she has of the receptions with which she is threatened." And it's really after this point that we see her refusing, apart from in exceptional circumstances, to allow herself to be photographed or painted or sketched. This carte de visite was taken in 1856, but this was taken at special request of Queen Victoria, and I think that when Queen Victoria asks you to have your photograph taken, you get down to the studio quick smart. She sat for the famous bust of the Head and Shoulders bust that's in the entrance hall at the museum by Sir John Steele. But this was exceptional because it was produced as it was funded rather by a collection that was organised by the soldiers, and so because of this, she felt that she had to do that. But nearly all of the requests, and we have this recorded, nearly all of the requests for recording her image were refused. And this is including one of the most famous images of Nightingale. As I'm sure you know, this isn't at the Florence Nightingale Museum, very sadly. It's at the National Portrait Gallery. And it's well worth a look because there's actually an earlier version of it next to it they have on display. And it's quite interesting to compare the two and how the picture developed. Jerry Barrett is the artist, and the painting's A Mission of Mercy. Barrett was forced to go ahead without a sitting from Nightingale, much to his annoyance. We have a letter that she wrote to him saying that she would in no way forward the making a show of myself. He rather weirdly did claim to have done a bit of sneaky sketches of her as a model for to model for this picture, that he'd sort of trailed her off when she was going out for a walk one day. But I think art historians believe that by comparing this picture with some of the photographs, it's fairly clear that he did actually work from photographs. On returning to England, despite her very impressive output in terms of her work and influence, Nightingale more or less remained an invalid for the next 53 years of her life. And it's really interesting to chart her health in the few remaining portraits that we have of Nightingale at this time. It's impossible to know what was actually wrong with her, but it seems likely that most of her later health problems were caused by her contracting what's known as Crimean fever. Brucellosis is its medical term. This was the third most common fever in the Crimean War, the first two being typhoid and typhus. And she had been taken extremely ill in the spring of 1855 when visiting the Crimea itself. She'd actually left Istanbul and actually gone into the field itself. But because of the incubation period, it's possible that she actually did contract it in Scutari. The bacteria that causes this fever is Brucella melintensis, and it wasn't identified until 1887, and is often contracted from infected milk or cheese. But part of the symptoms of brucellosis are irritability, depression, and these are both qualities that Nightingale did display during ill health in later years. Also, the attacks are sometimes years apart, which is also perhaps quite characteristic of the later life of an invalid that Nightingale led. And that the reasons for Nightingale's ill health have been a particular bone of contention for her biographers over the years. Some people argue that her illness was psychosomatic or that she had mental health issues. If she did have brucellosis, of course, there are many overlaps between the symptoms of brucellosis and of depression, particularly, for example, chronic fatigue, insomnia, anxiety, and so forth. Her health appears to be, from what we can tell, fairly unpredictable. So on her return, she travelled up to Balmoral, for example. Occasionally she talked of going to India, and India was a real passion for her in her later years, reforming the sanitation of India. But yet, periodic fever and fatigue remained a real issue for her. But by the time we'd reached the late 1850s, she lived more or less in seclusion. But yet she still worked furiously hard. And there are records that, because people would come to her, the sketch that we saw earlier with John Sutherland, people would come to her, and we have descriptions of a 3-hour meeting in the morning, a 4-hour meeting in the afternoon. And her output was extraordinary. If you remember, Notes on Nursing is a best-selling work. There are reports, thousands of letters. The amount that she actually produced, basically from her bedroom was really, or from her private rooms, was really extraordinary. She worked on improving the arrangements for soldiers' health and on general hospital reform, and also on nursing education, setting up the Nightingale Training School in 1860. But as well as her religious writings, Suggestions for Thought was published in the same year that the school opened. But I sometimes think, like Charles Darwin, her influence was all the more because of being that of a recluse, perhaps. Although some of her family members questioned quite how ill she was because of her tremendous output, it seems that those who lived very near her never questioned her health. So we have that as evidence, at least. In terms of her appearance, one change from the late 1850s onwards was her weight. A friend was very surprised to note in 1861 that she had grown fat. Although we have this carte de visite behind me that's in 1858, and here she still looks very thin, one assumes from the ill health or the hard work in Scutari. So there are no portraits at all from the early 1860s until we get to this unfinished one by George Frederick Watts, which is now at the Watts Gallery in Surrey, and this is painted in 1866. And Watts, of course, painted very notable people, and he had originally approached Sir Harry Vernie and Parthenope to ask Nightingale if she would sit for him. And she agreed to 1 or perhaps 2 sittings, we know, which is why this work is unfinished, rather tantalisingly. But I think there's some interesting work being done at Birkbeck at the moment, as you probably know, on the idea of pain and all of the different manifestations of pain throughout history. And I think that, well, for me, this portrait, more than any others, I think if you look particularly around her eyes, I think this is a portrait of somebody who is actually in pain. At this period, Watts was very influenced by Rossetti, and I think perhaps we can see this in the big sweeps of rich blue, but alas, we'll never know what the portrait would have looked like if it had been completed. Nightingale's brother-in-law, Harry Vernie, was the chair of the council of the Nightingale School, and in some years the nurses were invited to Claydon on a sort of day out, and on at least 2 occasions that the nurses did their annual jolly, Nightingale was present. Now, by the 1850s, group shots began to become a lot more popular. And this is because of the much shorter exposure time. It's, if you're just photographing one person and getting them to keep still for a long period of time, but having a group shot and making them all stay still for a long time was just a logistical nightmare. But these photographs give, a fascinating record of them having a day out. And if we add that to the recordings of letters and so forth, we know that they played tennis and they took walks in the grounds and so forth. And here we have Harry Vernie, who is in the middle of the back row, and Florence Nightingale in the middle. Claydon itself, as you possibly know, is now a National Trust house, although the Vernie family are still based there and are very supportive of the Nightingale Museum. It's well worth a visit, I think, particularly as Nightingale's 2 primary London residences are now no longer standing. And if you do go to Clayton, you can see the room that she used as a bedroom and the room next to it as a sitting room. They're both north-facing, and according to the custodian, they're really bitterly cold pretty well all year round. And I think perhaps you can see that because she looks fairly well wrapped up to me in this photograph that's taken in the blue room at Clayton. And you get a nice shot of some of the Palladian egg and dart decoration on the walls behind her. Now this is my personal favourite portrait of Nightingale. It's probably taken in 1907 because there was a flurry of interest in Nightingale at this time, as she was given the Order of Merit by the King in the October of this year. And that was the first time it had ever been given to a woman. This photograph's taken by a society photographer called Lizzie Caswell Smith. She'd taken portraits of J.M. Barrie, of George Bernard Shaw. In case I've got any people who are interested in theatre history in the audience, if you wanted to look up Lizzie Caswell Smith, she took some really amazingly arch photographs of Shakespearean actors in full costume, which really are quite amazing actually. But she also photographed, she had close associations with the suffrage movement, and she also photographed Christabel Pankhurst and Millicent Fawcett. So she was quite an interesting character, and one that I think deserves to have a lot more work carried out on her. This portrait, Caswell Smith wrote on the back, was the only one that she took outside of a studio, which I think which makes it particularly interesting. And I think the reason I like it so much is that because it's as much of Nightingale's room and surroundings. It's as much a portrait of where she was as of Nightingale herself. So we can see, we can get an idea of some of the art. That there is another photograph as well that's slightly out of focus that we have in the collection. And for that one, we can see more of the art that she had on the walls. We can see that the bunch of flowers that we know from written accounts that she always liked to have near her. We know from written accounts that the art on the walls included a view of a sunset in Egypt and also a lithograph of the ground around Sevastopol. And we can see that the fine lace that she liked to wear on her head that was made in the cottages near Clayton. And it was described as being a very airy and uncluttered room. Now, I think to our modern eyes, this doesn't actually look uncluttered at all. So I think, again, that gives us a hint of how incredibly cluttered this sort of, well, Edwardian really, but late Victorian style would have been. So, to conclude, I'd like to now just step back and examine the evidence that we have before us, or at least you have before you, I've had behind me over the course of this talk. And the question, of course, is, by examining Nightingale in the role of subject in portraiture, what do we actually learn about her that we couldn't have told from other sources, that we couldn't have found out from letters, biographies, memoirs, and so forth? Arguably, I think the portraits would just reinforce what we already know about her life. We can assume that she was willing to sit for an artistic sister and cousin, although I think perhaps this is a blight of all of us who have relations with artistic pretensions, that they're often sort of following you around and asking you to sit for them. But it could perhaps indicate an acquiescence and a willingness to please those that she loved, which I think gives quite a nice angle into her as a young woman. It also, as I think I've hopefully demonstrated, gives us an example of the really extraordinarily high quality of amateur art that was produced by young women at that time. And it wasn't, Hilary was perhaps a bit out of the ordinary, but Parthenope's work wasn't seen as being particularly unusual in terms of quality. The 1850s fashion for carte de visite photographs have created for us the more enduring images of Nightingale. And I think they can be particularly interesting for us because we can see that they're taken on either side of her time in Scutari. The craze for this style of photographs encompasses Nightingale's beginnings of having a really passionate dislike of having her image recorded. And as I hope I've shown, this was a lot deeper and a lot more than just not liking having her photograph taken, which there's plenty of people, even nowadays, who don't like having their photograph taken. But it's rather that she has this reluctance for exposing herself to the public gaze. And we can see in this reluctance links to her religious faith, but also to the reclusive way that she did leave. She lived the remaining half of her life. And of course, it is this very reclusiveness that perhaps contributed to the extraordinary reach of her influence. My own feeling is that by looking at these photographs, we actually obtain no amazingly huge and previously unthought of truths into Nightingale's life. What we do get, and I personally feel this is really of huge value, is, to quote Amanda Vickery, it helps us put on our 19th century spectacles. We know from letters that she always loved to surround herself with flowers, and this is in complete contradiction to the other famous eminent Victorian, Thomas Carlyle, who absolutely hated cut flowers in any way at all. But we don't know what sort of flowers they were, or how they were arranged, apart from these pictorial images. So we know that she liked to wear lace on her head, but apart from these images, we don't know. We could have assumed that it was a more usual lace cap. We didn't know that it was a big square of lace that tied under the chin, which is a lot more unusual. So these are two tiny examples, but there are many of them. And my feeling is that these tiny examples combine to give us a much clearer view of this extraordinary woman and the extraordinary century in which she lived. Thank you very much indeed.